Nietzsche. Well, all right, let's do this since I'm here.
Was so extraordinarily successful in promoting her brother and his works that by the end of the 1930s,
Nietzsche does start writing a book
pervaded
on the
German
will.
society.
The will
And
to
this
power.
was disturbingly reflected in one of the most compelling propaganda films of all time.
Remember, Hitler was one of those influenced. And you might remember the Nuremberg, whatever you call it. This is from the
In
film
1934, Nazi supporters gathered in Nuremberg to hear their leader speak. It was a moment captured in a film commissioned by Hitler himself. Terrifying, electrifying, the words and rituals of the Nazis echo Nietzschean thought. It was called Triumph of the Will.
That whole video is online for free if you're
descending
interested.
from the clouds, echoing Zarathustra, and Übermensch coming down from the mountains with his new morality to be greeted by the herd. An Übermensch offering a system of morality in which traditional Christian values are to be inverted. Where the state will exert the will of the most powerful, and the weak and the helpless will be destroyed to generate a greater humanity. So closely associated had Nietzsche's ideas become with the aims of the National Socialists that one of its most influential thinkers, Alfred Baumler, said, "When we call out Heil Hitler, we greet with the same cry, Friedrich Nietzsche." And yet, had he lived to see this, Nietzsche would have been horrified.
By the way, I'm not sure that she's right about that, but maybe. Let's arguable bit. Okay, here's. But the other one that I wanted to mention was Richard Wagner, or Richard Wagner. Because Wagner was influenced by Schopenhauer.
Nietzsche
And
believed
both
Wagner was an
Schopenhauer-
artistic genius whose music was going to bring about a cultural rebirth based on the classical Greek model of tragedy. It was an art form that Nietzsche was convinced could transform a world full of suffering into something beautiful and meaningful. How did Nietzsche come to write The Birth of Tragedy? I mean, what was he trying to do with this book, do you think?
Nietzsche wrote The Birth of Tragedy after a series of incredibly intense conversations with Wagner. Wagner was developing a revolutionary theory of art, where art could transform society. Nietzsche wanted to provide the philosophy for that. He found in Greek tragedy a model for that thinking. Greek tragedy tells these extremely visceral stories of human beings in conflict, suffering, destructive. Yet it was the dominant genre of thinking about the glory of Greece. Consequently, he found in Greek tragedy a way of talking about the human being today, the human beings are suffering, finding meaning in life, finding the truth.
So what is so explosive about what he's putting down on the page?
Well, Nietzsche structured his book around an opposition between two Greek gods, Apollo and Dionysus. Apollo stood for light, for the truth of logic, for control. And since the beginning of Germans' love of Greek, they associated Greece with rationality, the beginnings of philosophy. But Nietzsche decided he wanted to focus more on Dionysus, the figure who confuses boundaries, who discovers ecstatic group activity, dancing, wildness, the visceral feelings. And he made that the centre of his tragedy. So he was standing against philosophy, against his own subject, against that sense that logic is the way to truth. He wanted to find another sort of truth, another transformative power.
But how does he think that Dionysus, with all his darkness, and as you say, chaos sometimes and loss of control, how is that going to help mankind?
Nietzsche was reacting against the dominant German intellectual tradition, which focused on the individual hero, the Oedipuses, if you like. And they saw that the individual who suffered could somehow transcend themselves through suffering, a very Christian message. Nietzsche reversed that and saw instead that the individual somehow lost themselves in the collective and found in a group experience an ecstatic, transformational experience. And that's what he saw in Wagner's music, and that's what he saw in tragedy. So that somehow the suffering that was everybody's condition was transformed through this ecstatic experience into an affirmation of life. This life, here and now. It's a bit like that sense of a rock concert. Okay, the idea that you somehow you lose yourself in this great ecstatic collective experience. And one should never forget that opera in the 19th century was the rock music of its time, and Wagner was the rock icon of his day. And Nietzsche believed that's a way that society could be transformed through a sense of the collective experience from which you could go out and change the world.
Wagner's theatre was a temple to his brilliance, but it was also the place where Nietzsche fell violently out of love with his hero.
When Nietzsche came here to watch a performance of Wagner's opera The Ring, he hated what he found. Rather than a place of revolution, the theatre was stuffed with the great and the good of Europe. And a man that he'd revered as a radical, who he thought would catalyse the birth of a brave new world, was just the hero of a self-satisfied festival of opera, revelling in his own glory.
That's by Roy, by the way. Still today, it's there, and it has the festival, the Wagner Festival. You can't get tickets except for like 5 years out, and they're quite expensive, as you can imagine. There are other Wagner festivals. There's one in Seattle, by the way, that you can get tickets to, and so on. One of my friends here from Anchorage went one year, and he sat in the theater and looked around and realized he was surrounded by Nazis. Okay, that could be funny or not. So, what's the Ring cycle? That's really, you've probably heard of that. You're probably familiar with at least some of the melodies from it. The Ride of the Valkyries, I imagine, at least. You know, I can't sing. I don't have talent. But you know, if you can imagine the maidens with the horns and the spears and the shields, riding the horses. Yes? Everybody's familiar with it? Okay. That's from Die Valkyrie. There's 4 operas in the Ring cycle. The first one is Das Rheingold, which is the gold of the Rhine. The second one is Die Valkyrie. The Valkyries were the daughters of Wotan and Erda, the earth, right? There were 9 of them, I think, and they were basically the maidens that went to battles and picked up the dead bodies of the heroes and took them to Valhalla. That was the myth, right? And the chief of the Valkyries was Brunhild, which of course is probably pretty famous as well. The third opera was Siegfried. And remember, Hitler used lots of these noun names from this series as part of his battle plans and so on. The Siegfried line you might have heard of, for example. And Siegfried is the son of Wotan and Erda, but this time they were a Skrellingspar. Schwellingspaar is they're twins. Schwellingspaar. I think that's so cool. German, Schwellingspaar. And so it's actually Siegfried is the son of the Schwellingspaar. They, who are Sigmund and Sieglinde, end up they're twins, but nonetheless they fall in love and have Siegfried. So yes, that's kind of let's not go there. In any case, Siegfried ends up being Sieg means victory, and Fried means free, right? So he's finally free enough to do what Wotan wants, which is to kill the dragon and get the forbidden gold, the Rhine gold, and bring it hopefully back to Wotan. Actually, he ends up destroying Wotan's power and keeping the gold himself until he's killed by the enemy who wants to get the gold for themselves, right? And so Siegfried ends up being stabbed in the back by the gnome's son. So in any case, as Siegfried is placed on a funeral pyre, where Brunhild rides her horse Grane into the fire and dies with him, right? The fire spreads and goes over to Valhalla and destroys Valhalla, and so the gods are destroyed. So the last opera is Die Götterdämmerung, or the Twilight of the Gods. And so this whole series, of course, you can see how it inspires Hitler, because when he's in the bunker on the last days, he wanted to emulate Siegfried, and so he did. So he shot himself in the head and had him and his wife's body, Eva Braun, taken out of the bunker, and they spread gasoline on the two of them and lit them on fire and cremated them. So he had his own, burning day, whatever you want to call it. And that's why apparently they couldn't find Hitler when the Russians finally captured the place, because he had been burned away. But you can see Hitler's mindset is, he wants to imitate this great, destructive ending of Wagner's operas, which, you could go see them, at the opera, or they're on video. Of course, you could watch multiple versions of them. Some of them are quite oddly performed because of modern staging and so on. But you can watch them actually performed in Bayreuth. They're all on the web, so you can watch them. But so Wagner is writing to honor Schopenhauer. What frustrates Wotan is the will. This concept that Schopenhauer gives us of, no matter what you do, you're screwed either way, right? And so Wotan is screwed, by this fate motif, which Wagner, of course, gives us in the Ring cycle. It's not the only operas that he wrote, by the way. He wrote some other ones. If you're familiar, Lohengrin was the first one I became familiar with as a kid. And I even got to see it performed by the Met in Philadelphia with Sandor Kanya doing Lohengrin, really fantastic. And so on. We saw it in Berlin, actually. My wife and I went, and she was bored to death. But she does like some operas, so we got to see Prince Igor, which was very embarrassing. It was an opera being offered in the East Berlin theater, and I let the Russian department. I remember I worked in Berlin as a Russian translator, and I let the Russian department know, hey, the opera is going to be a Russian opera. Let's go see it. And I ended up with a whole busload of translators and their spouses. We all drove and went to the theater. In fact, we were practically the only ones there, and we're all sitting there in our uniforms in the first 2 rows. And the preface, the intro plays, and it's a beautiful orchestral piece. And then they come out and they start to sing in German. And everybody looked with military precision down the row at me and pointed out the next time I invited everybody to a Russian opera, make sure it's in Russian.